The Fillmore West, San Francisco, California, February 1st, 1968. Thursday night. The fog was already rolling in from the bay by 8 o'clock, wrapping the streets of the Fillmore district in the particular kind of cold that San Francisco does better than any other city on the continent. A cold that is not brutal but is insistent, that gets through whatever you are wearing and makes itself known in the bones. Inside the venue, none of that existed. Inside the Fillmore West, there was only heat, light, the smell of bodies and incense and amplifier tubes warming up, and the low continuous hum of electricity moving through thousands of feet of cable toward the moment when it would transform into sound. Jimi Hendrix was 25 years old. He had been born James Marshall Hendrix in Seattle, Washington, in 1942, the son of a father who kept sending his guitar away and a calling that kept bringing it back. He had spent years playing behind other people's acts on the road circuits of the South and the East, absorbing everything, learning the instrument with the obsessive patience of someone who understood, without being able to articulate it in those years, that the guitar was not a tool he was learning to use but a language he was learning to speak. A language that had never been spoken quite the way he wanted to speak it, which was the reason he had to learn it himself, from the inside out, from the strings to the bone. He had gone to London in 1966 because in London they were ready to hear something they had not heard before. The British rock scene of that moment was hungry for exactly the kind of disruption that Jimi represented. He formed the experience with Noel Redding on bass and Mitch Mitchell on drums, and they hit the English clubs and the English press with the force of something that does not have a precedent and therefore cannot be properly classified, only experienced and then discussed for years afterward by people who were never quite sure they had found the right words. By February of 1968, the experience had already released Are You Experienced and Axis, Bold as Love. They had played the Monterey Pop Festival the previous summer, and the footage of that performance had become one of those cultural documents that people reference the way they reference watersheds, not as something that happened, but as a before and after. The British guitar community, the American music press, the musicians who were already considered the best in the world, had responded to Hendrix the way the world responds to something that moves the baseline, not with rejection, but with a kind of involuntary reassessment, the reassessment of people who have to update their understanding of what is possible. He was tuning his Stratocaster in the backstage area of the Fillmore West at 7:30, 45 minutes before showtime. The backstage at the Fillmore in those years was not glamorous. It was functional. Cinderblock walls painted a shade of off-white that the venue's lighting made look yellow. Metal folding chairs, a craft services table with cold cuts, and 2 bottles of wine that were there because they were always there, and not because anyone had specifically requested them. The kind of space that becomes legendary, not because of what it looks like, but because of who passed through it. Jimi was alone with his guitar, in the way that musicians who are about to perform are alone even when the room is full of people. His head was slightly down, his ear close to the strings, his hands moving across the neck with the unhurried precision of someone who is not performing tuning, but actually listening. He had a particular relationship with the tuning process that his bandmates and his roadies had learned to respect by leaving undisturbed. It was not simply the technical preparation of an instrument. It was something closer to what a conversation with yourself is before you have to say something important. The door from the main corridor opened and a man walked in that Jimi recognized immediately, and that half the room recognized immediately, and that the other half recognized within 3 seconds of looking, because recognition of this man was essentially involuntary for anyone who had spent time around electric guitar music in the last 4 years. His name was Derek Colton. He was 28 years old, British, from Birmingham, the son of a factory worker and a piano teacher who had given up the piano for the guitar at 14 and had never given it back. He had been the lead guitarist for 2 bands that had achieved the level of success that gets you on the covers of the serious music publications but does not yet get you into stadiums. He was technically accomplished in a way that was genuinely rare, with a precision of execution that studio engineers talked about with the specific admiration of people who work with many musicians and know the difference between good and exceptional. He had been written about in Melody Maker and Rolling Stone with the kind of language that music criticism reserves for people it has decided to position as significant. He had also spent the last 3 months making statements in interviews and in private conversations at parties and backstage gatherings that had found their way back through the music community's invisible network of shared information to the people they were most directly about. The statements were variations of the same thesis, that Hendrix was image more than substance, that the theatrics, the guitar behind the head, the teeth playing, the burning of the instrument at Monterey, were the product of a promotional strategy designed to compensate for technical limitations. That the real guitar players, the ones who had put in the years of structured study and could demonstrate it with clean execution in every register and every tempo, were being overshadowed by spectacle. That the market had confused performance art with musicianship, and that when you sat down and stripped away everything except the notes, the hierarchy looked different than the magazine covers suggested. These statements had reached Jimi in the way these things reach people, filtered through second-hand accounts, misquoted, exaggerated in some places, and understated in others, but consistent enough in their core claim to constitute something that had a shape and a direction and a clear author. Jimi had responded to hearing them the same way he responded to most provocations, by not responding at all in any public or semi-public way. His manager had noted this with relief because the alternative would have been messy and unnecessary. His bandmates had noted it with the understanding of people who knew that Jimi processed everything through the guitar and that the guitar would answer when it answered. The guitar had not answered yet. Colton came into the backstage room with 2 members of his own band, who were opening the Fillmore shows that week, and with the energy of a man who had been building toward something and had arrived at the place where it could happen. He greeted people in the room with the cordial competence of a British musician navigating an American music scene he was trying to establish himself in. He was charming in the way that people who are aware of being charming are charming, with a slight excess of ease that serves as its own small signal. He crossed the room to where Jimi was sitting with the guitar. The greeting he offered was genuine enough. They had met twice before, briefly, at industry events in London. There was no bad blood in the personal sense of the word. What there was between them was an argument that Colton had started without addressing Jimi directly, which is a specific kind of argument that operates below the surface until the moment it does not. They talked for a few minutes about logistics, about the bill, about how the Fillmore crowds compared to London crowds. And then Colton said what he had come backstage to say, with the delivery of someone who has rehearsed the casualness of a line until it sounds unrehearsed. "You know, I've been thinking about what you do," he said. "The whole thing. I think what you've built is something that works extraordinarily well as a total package. The look, the movement, the theater of it. Genuinely impressive as a construction." He paused the way people pause when they want the addition to land with full weight. "I just wonder sometimes if the guitar itself would hold up to the same scrutiny without the frame around it, on its own terms, purely as guitar playing." The room did not go visibly silent. The people in it were too aware of the possibility of witnessing something they would later want to have witnessed to make the obvious move of falling quiet. But a certain quality of attention shifted. Conversations continued, but they continued at reduced volume with reduced commitment to themselves. Jimi looked at Colton. He had a way of looking at people that was not aggressive, but was also not willing to pretend it was not doing what it was doing. It was a look that registered and held. He said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quiet register it always had, the voice of someone who had nothing to add to the volume of a room that was already loud enough. "What do you play?" he asked. "Les Paul," Colton said. "Have it here for the show." Jimi nodded once. He looked at the Stratocaster in his lap. He looked at the amplifier in the corner. He said, "Plug it in." In the 10 minutes that followed, something happened in that backstage room at the Fillmore West that the people who were present would spend the next several decades describing with varying levels of linguistic success. The challenge of describing it was not that it was subtle. It was that the vocabulary available for describing what a guitar player does when he is doing what only he can do at the level at which only he can do it has never been quite adequate to the experience of being in the room when it is happening. Colton played first because Jimi gestured for him to go ahead. He played with the full capacity of what he had, which was genuine. The Les Paul, through the small practice amp that one of the roadies had pulled out of a corner, produced the thick, warm, precise sound that British blues rock guitar in 1968 produced at its best. His technique was real. He worked through a progression that showed what he could do in several different registers, clean runs that landed exactly where they were aimed, bends that resolved with accuracy, a rhythmic feel that was solid and intentional. Anyone hearing it in any other context would have heard excellent guitar playing. In this context, it was the opening statement of an argument, and it was well made. When he stopped, he looked at Jimi with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not completely succeeding. Jimi put the Stratocaster strap over his shoulder. He did not look at the audience in the room. He did not look at Colton. He looked at the guitar for a moment, the way you look at something you know completely but still choose to look at before the important moment, the look of confirmation and trust. Then he played. What came out of the Stratocaster in that backstage room was not a demonstration in the technical sense that Colton's playing had been a demonstration. It was not a rebuttal in the argumentative sense. It was something that did not have a clean category, because it was doing too many things at once, and all of them at a level that overloaded the critical apparatus you bring to listening. The sound was wrong in every way that sound is supposed to be controlled, and right in every way that sound communicates something true about the human interior. Notes bent past the point where the pitch was supposed to resolve, and then found resolution somewhere the listener had not anticipated. The vibrato was not the metronomic vibrato of a player executing a technique, but something that breathed the way biological things breathe, with variation and intention that seemed simultaneous. The chord voicings were familiar enough to be recognized and modified enough to be completely personal. The rhythm underneath was not separate from the melody, but woven through it in a way that made the distinction between the two irrelevant. He played for 4 minutes. Nobody moved. The 2 members of Colton's band stood with their drinks not at their mouths. A roadie who had been coiling cable stopped and left the cable half-coiled. The craft services table was 2 feet from the amplifier, and the man who had been making a sandwich at it put the bread down. When he stopped, the room stayed with the sound for a few seconds, the way rooms stay with a sound that has been larger than the room. Colton said nothing immediately. What was on his face was not embarrassment exactly, and it was not defeat exactly. It was something more specific and more honest than either of those. It was the expression of someone who has made an argument with complete confidence in its merit, and has then been shown, with absolute directness, and without a single unnecessary word, the flaw in the argument's foundation. The flaw was this. He had been evaluating Hendrix the way you evaluate a craftsman, by the precision of the execution against a known standard. But Jimi was not a craftsman in that sense. He was doing something else with the guitar, something that used technique the way a language uses grammar, as a means to meaning, and not as the meaning itself. And you cannot evaluate whether someone has something to say by measuring how elegantly they conjugate their verbs. Jimi put the guitar down and looked at Colton with the same quiet attention as before. "It's not about the frame," he said. "The frame is just so people who haven't heard it before have a place to stand while they're figuring out what they're listening to. The guitar is the guitar." He paused. "You play well? You should play your own thing instead of measuring it against somebody else's." Colton nodded. The nod was genuine. It was the nod of someone who has been given something he did not expect to receive in the form he did not expect to receive it in, which is honest engagement rather than dismissal. He picked up his Les Paul and left the backstage room with his bandmates. What he said to them in the hallway, none of the people who remained in the room could hear. 45 minutes later, Jimi Hendrix walked onto the stage of the Fillmore West and played what the people who were there that night describe as one of the best performances they ever witnessed in that building, which is a statement that carries significant weight given the history of that building and the people who had performed in it. He played like someone for whom the argument was already over before it began, not because he had won it, but because he had never been having it. He had been having a different conversation entirely, a conversation with the instrument and with the people in the audience and with the music itself. And that conversation had been going on for his entire life and would continue for as long as he was alive to have it. Derek Colton's band opened the show that night to a warm and respectful reception. Colton played well. There were moments in his set where you could see something working through him that had not been working through him an hour earlier. A quality of presence, of not measuring, of playing towards something rather than away from something, that made his band set that evening better than it had been at the previous night's show. 2 people in the venue noticed this without being able to say exactly why. One of them was his drummer. The other was Mitch Mitchell, who was standing at the side of the stage with his arms crossed, watching with the professional attention of someone who respects genuine craft no matter whose name is on the marquee. The story of that backstage room circulated through the music world over the following years in the way that stories from that world circulate, incomplete, partially accurate, sometimes reduced to a punchline about a challenge and a response, sometimes inflated into something more dramatic than it was. It was neither. It was quieter and more honest than the legend version, and more significant than the punchline version. What it was, at its core, was this. 2 guitar players in a cinder block room. One who came to prove something, and one who sat there already knowing something, and the knowledge was not about technique or repertoire or the ability to execute in every register. The knowledge was simpler and harder to acquire than any of that. It was the knowledge of what the guitar was for. Not for proving, not for measuring, not for winning the argument about who was better, which is an argument that music itself does not recognize as valid and has never recognized as valid since the first person stretched a string across a hollow cavity and discovered that the air inside the cavity had its own voice. Jimi Hendrix died in London on September 18, 1970. He was 27 years old. The world responded by becoming uncertain how to talk about him without inadequacy, which is the response the world has to people it has not finished processing. The guitar he played that night in the backstage room of the Fillmore West was a white Stratocaster. It had been modified in ways that reflected years of specific and personal requirements. It was not a standard instrument. It was the instrument he had made it into through use, through preference, through the accumulated decisions of a player who had learned what he needed from a guitar and had adjusted the guitar accordingly. Like every guitar Jimi played, it sounded like no one else. That was not the frame. That was the thing itself.